Welcome everyone to our webinar, Beyond the Signature, CFR 21, Part 11 for Digital Record Integrity. My name is Lynn and I'm the Campaign and Field Marketing Manager here at Drummond. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers, Michael Henry, VP of Growth Strategy at Drummond, and Michael Zgorowski, Risk Assessor at Drummond. I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, for that introduction. Michael, maybe we can jump right into this. With respect to some of the basics a bit. What is 21 CFR Part 11? Who does it impact and why is it important?
Of course. I just want to break down the title a little bit first. We're mentioning CFR Title 21 Part 11. I'll be referring to it as Part 11 throughout this presentation. But just as a breakdown, what is CFR? CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. Title 21 is the specific section that regulates the food and drugs. So includes FDA, DEA, and a few other regulatory bodies in there. And Part 21 is specifically talking about electronic records. Like we mentioned, this specific subsection is going to be created for the FDA. It was mandated by them. Congress actually provided them the authority to govern organizations within this industry to mandate them, to follow them. So it is a legal obligation. What it is in entirety is just a standard set of regulations for how electronic records need to be documented and followed, as well as the electronic signature process. So if you have to attest to something, authorize something, there are specific requirements for what that needs to entail. And when we're talking about specific businesses or industries that need to comply with this, it's going to include human and veterinary drugs. There is going to be a component for foods. Medical devices are a big component of that as well. Cosmetics, dietary supplements, and we did mention tobacco products. It also does include some veterinary animal food and feed, things of that nature. We also like to call out that it does also fall under clinical trials. There's a requirement for this under laboratory testing when you're following those documents as a part of that testing. And then R&D for pharma and biotech, so when you're manufacturing new pharmaceuticals. This also should incorporate all the supply chain that falls under these industries, right? So you might have a third party that might help you with lab testing or might provide you the precursors to some of the items that you're manufacturing, under CGMP, the good manufacturing practices. They might be required to follow Part 11 as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I like the way that you called it a legal obligation, just like HIPAA, and also highlighting the supply chain. We've seen a lot of demand from this here at Drummond, particularly in the health IT area. We've seen a lot of interest from people also in electronic prescribing supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about that difference, though, the overlap between the FDA and the DEA and how those are different?
Of course. And we do see a lot of overlap. It's kind of a Venn diagram situation. I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert in EPCS. For sure, I'm not. But I think it's important to call out slight differences between them. We did mention it is a Venn diagram. So you may be following Part 11. You might be following Part 1311, which is the EPCS portion. Just because you're compliant with one doesn't mean you're compliant with the other. It is possible to be following both to the T. But notable highlights is obviously it is an FDA requirement. So you may fall under the FDA, but not fall under the DEA. Part 11 allows for post-signature edits. Obviously, there needs to be an audit trail there, whilst EPCS doesn't necessarily allow that. There is some flexible authentication for Part 11. There's some more stringent requirements with audit trails and audit logs under Part 11. One of the big requirements is having human readable formatted audit logs. So you don't necessarily need to dig through logs or run queries to identify actions that users made. There is a strict requirement that it needs to be human readable, and somebody like a system administrator or an office administrator would both be able to access them and go and see the actions that individual users have taken within the system. Obviously, there's retention requirements for both. Part 11 doesn't necessarily outline retention requirements, while EPCS does. So we see many different retention periods. We see 5-year, we see 7-year. Depending on which part of the industry you're in, you may be required to hold on to those records for longer than that. And then there's also a requirement for written policies and procedures regarding your systems surrounding those electronic signatures and the maintenance of those records. This also includes a training aspect of it as well. So your employees need to be trained on how to use that system. They need to be knowledgeable. They need to understand what they're doing as they are, using that system and attesting or signing to different records within that platform.
Great. As I know you're aware, we've seen pretty strong demand for validation this year. What do you think is driving that?
I think there's a plethora of different reasons there. I think the biggest one that we've been seeing is digital transformation. A lot of these pharmaceutical companies and pharmacies, doctors' offices are using a lot of legacy systems, right? We see a lot of paper records, and that digital transformation is now kind of allowing them to move more to the digital side and have less of that paper trail. However, that still requires you to have those audit trails, audit logs, having things documented, things like that. So Part 11 allows you to fulfill that requirement while still using a digital platform. There's also been a lot of increased regulatory scrutiny. I think post-COVID, everybody was kind of drinking from the water hose during that time period. And now that we're going back into a steady state, people have moved to different vendors, people have moved processes. And now we're getting to the point where we need to get back to the standards that we used to be adhering to. So increased regulatory scrutiny is a big factor in there as well. We also have a lot of data complexity. Again, globalized operations, so international brands where they may be operating in the United States, they may be operating, in Europe or in Latin America, in many different places. They now also need to make sure that they're following US standards as well if they are operating here. And then we're seeing a lot of new technology just in general. We're seeing AI is a big thing. I don't want to use buzzwords, but AI is massive. And we're seeing that AI is particularly being used to scan through documents, look through reports, things of that nature, removing some of the human element. Even though it's being used as a tool, there's still a requirement for people to test and to review documents that may be created. So there is that aspect in there as well. And then we're seeing a lot of startups too, Mike. Smaller companies who are breaking into the space, and they're just trying to make sure that they have all of their regulations in place prior to providing their product to their potential consumers. So I think that that's a big driver as well.
Yeah, I would agree. There definitely seems to be a constant evolution and growth within health IT that just allows it's a great place for startups, that entire ecosystem. We've identified who needs it, what the drivers are, but maybe I think talking about the actual compliance, what are the components of having a compliant system? What does that look like?
Yeah, we can go through high-level overview. Obviously, this list isn't going to be exhaustive, but some of the biggest hitting items that we have, obviously the electronic signature component. So what does that kind of entail? I think that kind of pairs very well together with the signature manifestation portion. So what needs to be a part of that electronic signature? You need to have the name of the individual who's completing that signature. There needs to be a formal timestamp as a part of that. Additionally, we want to see as a part of the e-signature what the person is signing for. So for example, are they an authorizer? Are they a reviewer? Are they a prescriber? Are they administering something? That needs to be documented as a part of that signature. And obviously that audit trail. So that record needs to go somewhere and needs to be protected to make sure I went in at this time, I signed, attested to this document. That needs to be retained. So that's a big piece as well. And then making sure that the electronic records themselves are maintaining integrity there, right? So we'll be discussing in a moment some of the different types of systems, but if your document that you're attesting to or reviewing is going to be leaving the closed garden of your application, there's a potential there for hash functions being required. So we would be looking at that as well. There's audit trail requirements. So not just the timestamp, we also need to look at what users are going in, what are they accessing, specific documents, things of that nature, and to the underlying systems as well to make sure that the integrity of those documents is being maintained. And then we've also got unique identifiers, your general access control requirements that we see through a lot of different standards and regulations, unique user identification, strong passwords, password aging, so making sure users are changing their passwords periodically, the ability to lock out users. They're general requirements. I don't think that they're particularly tough, but you just need to make sure that they're in place for your particular system. Then we also mentioned the record retention, right? So being as a part of the FDA and highly regulated industry, you need to make sure that you can retrieve those documents. Also, we're going to talk about inspections as well, right? So there's a capability for you to be audited if you need to go down the line or backtrack and see what happened 2 years previously. You have those records retained. You're able to retrieve them readily, and they are accurate. That's some of the biggest pieces there.
And Mike, you mentioned that there are different types of systems. Can you maybe give a little bit more background on that and how, if at all, those the differences impact compliance?
Yeah, so there is a little bit of a differentiation of controls that would be in scope for your organization, depending on what type of system you have. The two biggest designators that we have is an open system versus a closed system. We can start off with a closed system. You can really think of this as an application that's developed specifically for your organization. I did mention walled garden earlier. Think of it where you're the one that's provisioning your users. You're responsible for their password requirements. You're responsible for the training. You're responsible for the documentation of that system. It's all essentially in-house. And then you've also got open systems, right? So potentially there's users that are outside of your organization or direct customers that you might have. Patients, for example, that would be a great example of an open system. And I always like to use the example, DocuSign is the best example. If I have a document, I work for organization A, you work for organization B, I can send you a document through DocuSign, and you have the capability to actually sign that document, even though you're not a part of my organization.
Got it. So what are some of the real world examples of the types of software where this impacts the supply chain and people, as you mentioned, it's a legal obligation. They have to be compliant.
Of course, yeah. There's a few different common items that we see as far as software is concerned. Repeat customers that are going in and looking for Part 11 specifically. EHR systems, EMR systems are generally the biggest ones. We see a lot of pharmacy software. This is also going to come up. We're talking a lot about compounding nowadays, and people are actually manufacturing or potentially batching different types of compounds for their pharmacies that they're prescribing. That would now fall under Part 11 because they could be considered manufacturing those actual pharmaceuticals. Laboratory management systems, batch records for manufacturing. Again, going back to that CGMP, those manufacturing good practices, anybody who is manufacturing anything under cosmetics or dietary supplements would have records associated with those systems. And that goes into clinical data management systems. We talked a little bit about clinical trials earlier. So if you are using a system, you're looking for approval from the FDA, your records that you're creating during that clinical trial all need to be following Part 11. They need to have valid signatures. Otherwise, you run the risk where your application for approval might not be valid, right? You might lose that during that process. We've also got trivial master file systems, manufacturing execution systems. Again, we talked about manufacturing, device history records, so tracking devices throughout the manufacturing process or where they're placed within a facility, a clinic, things along those lines.
And we've talked, I've used the word legal obligation. You said it as well. So with that being the case, what are some of the penalties or risks associated with not following this requirement? Because, it is set forth by the FDA.
Of course. The first step that generally organizations are going to see is going to be some sort of a warning. That's going to be your first step. That may follow up with a citation. Obviously, this would be during the process of an inspection from the FDA. So they have the right, as a business that you're working under a regulated industry, they have the right to inspect you at any point in time. And there's a number of things that can trigger that. Citations are the biggest things that come up. And legal and financial penalties may be incorporated as a part of that. There's also product recalls, and that can also have its own financial burden on your business, although it might not be a direct fine from the FDA. If you're forced to recall your product and you have to do a stop sale or a stop manufacturing, there could be a significant amount of financial responsibility or burden rather to your specific entity, where you can't sell product anymore until you can fix the issue that you have. Obviously, there's a big problem of reputational damage there. Organizations that are inspected and receive warnings and or citations, those are all listed publicly on the FDA website. So if somebody looks up your business, there's a potential for them to actually find you on the FDA website, identify that you've received a warning or a citation, and they may consider going with another vendor or another provider instead of yourself. And there's also the potential for criminal penalties, right? If there's negligence that was identified during that process, or maybe you were warned and cited once and they come back for an inspection, there's the potential there for criminal penalties. As far as fines, though, direct fines from the FDA, they are a little loose. It depends on the size of your business and several other factors. But specifically for clinical trials, they can assess up to $10,000 per day after the first 30 days after receiving a letter of noncompliance or a warning letter. So that can rack up very quickly. It can get very costly after a month, 2 months. And if you're a smaller provider, obviously there's risk to your business there. So it's crucial that you're prepared for those potential inspections.
That can get costly just in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Given your experience in this area and the importance and the increased demand that we've seen for this, what are the more common areas that a developer or users typically have flagged that they need to be mindful of?
Yeah, so here's a breakdown a little bit of where we've seen previous inspections, warnings, and citations. I would say this is very much in line with some of the items that I've seen just through my experience throughout the past year or so working on some of these engagements. 31% have been just simply not having adequate audit trails. Again, we mentioned that's very important when we're looking at the integrity of these documents and records. 17% have been for access management, right? So making sure users have adequate access management, have adequate access controls to those critical systems. 15% were failing to validate their system. So internally, you're required to on an ongoing basis to monitor your systems, make sure that you're following all the standards and have everything in place. And then 17% were just due to record retention requirements. Organizations weren't following their own internal record retention policies, as well as potentially not following other standards or regulations for record retention.
So if you're a developer who needs to keep Part 11 top of mind, how would you gain confidence in your own compliance?
Yeah, we broke down a little bit of a roadmap on what we generally see a Part 11 program look like. And it all really starts with the initial gap assessment, getting a pulse check, a point in time, understanding where you are currently, identifying any gaps at that point. That way you can allow yourself and the business to work on remediating those items. Obviously, with that remediation, there's SOP development and updates that have to go on. We mentioned documentation, maintaining internal documentation. As you're making those changes and documenting your system, you need to make sure you're continually updating that documentation. And similar to documentation, we move kind of into employee training, making sure your employees are up to date on those systems as changes are being made. They know how to use those systems. They understand some of the requirements that go into those signatures, and there's no questions. And then we move into kind of an ongoing system validation, right? So we discussed that was a large sector of where we saw non-compliance. Ongoing system validation, on an ongoing basis, annual, after changes are being made to your systems, that's going to be critical, and making sure that you're documenting that. And that rolls you into your final stage of preparation, where you're preparing for an FDA audit. And it's just a culmination of all the steps that we just mentioned: maintaining that documentation, maintaining records of training, documenting your SOPs. And realistically, we help a lot of organizations with this we help them through all stages of the process, right? So some people are just at the initial gap assessment. They don't really know where to start. We also work with organizations that have gone through this before. They may have been inspected or they've done internal assessments. They think that they've remediated and just want a separate set of eyes to take a look at those systems. So regardless of where you are in the process, I think that there's value in potentially leveraging a third party.
Oh, that's great. And this compliance roadmap reminds me it's very similar to what we do with HIPAA, right? Same way, where in a lot of ways it is a legal obligation and something that we support people with in a similar process. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen a real uptick in this, this year, especially from developers asking us to validate their compliance with with Part 11. How do you see the role of third parties like Drummond in supporting this?
Yeah, like I just mentioned, I think a separate set of eyes can be very helpful to a lot of these developers. They're really more so focused on providing the value to their customers, and that might just be technical requirements, right? They may not have a very large GRC team or somebody who's very familiar with some of the FDA requirements. So we kind of provide that level of expertise where somebody can come in who's not new to the requirements, we're familiar with them, and we can very quickly identify any pain points that you might have. If everything looks great, we have the potential for validation documentation. So if you are a smaller organization and you are trying to work with third parties who also fall under the FDA requirements and they need their systems to have Part 11 items in there as well, your organization can potentially pitch to them. And if we provide you an attestation letter or something like that, it can give them additional assurance that, hey, your system is following these requirements and we can use it or leverage it within our business. So I think that's very important. And then additionally, we can do a deeper dive into some of the security and access controls, audit trail functionality, these items, review your SOPs, right? We can provide feedback on some of those items, look through your training records, make sure that everybody understands the requirements that go into using that platform. It's also important to note, some people ask for, what the cost is to something like this. Generally, we run, 4 to 6K on the information system. Many organizations have multiple systems, right? You may have one that's internal, one that's open, things of that nature. So, there's kind of a value proposition there, especially when we compare it to the previous slide when we were talking about fines or potentially a stop
Right.
sale. That can add up very quickly. And I think it's critical to kind of outweigh, is it worth getting inspected and not being compliant versus having that assurance internally, sleeping well at night that you have all your ducks in a row.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a small price to pay versus negative publicity and the financial and operational ramifications that could follow. No, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that was all that I had, and I think it's time for us to maybe open the floor to some questions. And I see
Yeah, I can jump into things. I think Mike has a great question. Most part, EHRs do not fall under FDA regulations. So in the real world example slide for industries falling under 21 CFR Part 11, why were EHRs listed? So we've actually worked with several EHR systems, specifically clinics that were documenting clinical trials, right? That's a specific use case, but they have to document some of the items as a part of those clinical trials within those EHR systems. And their administration of the items from the greater clinical trial required them as a business to have that. So there was that business case there. They were required under contract to participate. Their system needed to be validated under Part 11.
Yeah.
Edward, what should we look for when validating third-party software for Part 11 compliance? That's a great question. If you are a third party and you require Part 11, either there can be a third-party validation or some sort of an internal validation that they can provide you an assurance letter. Contract language is also very big. Ultimately, there is a little bit of risk transference there when you are leveraging a third party. But if they're contractually obligated to follow those requirements because they know that they're under the FDA, that should at least, at the minimum, have you covered. electronic system in a regulated environment need to comply with Part 11? Not necessarily, right? Depending on the scope of your business, there might be certain systems that do require that Part 11 piece. Other systems might not require that. So
I think
it's
also,
really,
Mike, it would have to do with the scope of the software or the electronic
course.
system itself, right?
Of course. So you have to consider business lines, what type of data it's touching, and realistically, who is that data being transmitted to? You might have multiple business lines where certain data in there does not fall under the FDA, and you might not be required to follow there. So it's really just a big scoping understanding of what those systems are being used for. And then we've got Vincent. How often should systems be revalidated? Realistically, anytime that there's any major changes, a system should be revalidated, right? There should be some sort of an internal discussion at a minimum to discuss, what changes have been made. Are you still following the requirements that you need to as a business, even with the new change? And I think that maybe that there's an additional gap assessment that could be had there internally, where you're just looking at during the development process, making sure you're not omitting any of the requirements, access controls or audit logs, making sure that key functionality doesn't get lost during any potential changes. We've got another question. How do biometric signatures fit into the Part 11 framework? So there is actually requirements for specific to biometric signatures if they are being used. There's not a requirement specifically to use them. There's other authentication mechanisms that you can use, but certain businesses are starting to leverage them more and more. So you do have that option as a business if you do want to integrate that.
Any other questions? I think that we might be there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for joining us. If you have questions or want to connect further, feel free to reach out using the email on the screen or visit drummondgroup.com.